Well, turning now to an update on our Tainted Water series, looking at groundwater contamination in Morrow and Umatilla counties in eastern Oregon. A bill in Salem to try and require fertilizer reporting from large farms in the state died in committee. But there's some background drama that's starting to make waves. But before we get to that, let's get you up to speed on the issue at the center of it all. More than 30 years ago, the state of Oregon discovered a massive aquifer covering 562 square miles near the town of Boardman is contaminated with nitrates. The chemical you cannot see, taste, or smell is harmful for people above limits set by the EPA, especially infants and pregnant women. Many wells in the area have nitrate levels above those limits, mostly belonging to people with low income. In the affected area called the Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area, or LUBGWAMA, as many as 4,500 wells have drilled down through the earth to get water from the contaminated aquifer for cooking and bathing and drinking and more. But over the decades, nitrates from farm fertilizer, commercial food production, and large animal operations have seeped down into the water, making the contamination worse. A state report released back in February included this graphic here. Now, every orange and red circle represents a well where the water should not be used for drinking or cooking. Now, as you can see, there are a lot, from Boardman to Hermiston and beyond. And those are just wells that have been tested for nitrate contamination at the time of the report. So where does the contamination come from? Well, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, has used these estimates for the past few years. Irrigated agriculture makes up the lion's share, nearly 70%, mostly due to fertilizer they use to grow their crops. Now, if the plants are not able to soak up all the nitrate-rich fertilizer, it seeps into the aquifer, contaminating the water. For decades, the state has relied on voluntary actions by farmers to try to stop the contamination. But those have not worked. In fact, the contamination has just gotten worse. But efforts to regulate fertilizer or require action on the part of farmers and businesses have gone nowhere. And that includes a bill introduced this legislative session in Salem. It's Senate Bill 747, and it would require farmers with at least 200 acres to report how much fertilizer that they use to the state. And then the Oregon DEQ could look at that data and potentially fine farmers who use too much fertilizer. Now, the state Republican who represents the affected area that we're talking about here testified to a Senate committee earlier this year, urging them to kill the bill.
At a time when Oregon's agricultural industry is facing rising costs, labor shortage, and increasing regulatory pressure, Senate Bill 747 would add yet another burden without offering meaningful benefits to farmers, the environment, or public health. Instead of imposing arbitrary reporting mandates, the state should work collaborative with farmers in a voluntary science-based approach.
So Representative Levy wants voluntary efforts, which, as we've reported, simply don't work and haven't for decades. She also testified that suggesting over-application of fertilizer is widespread is inaccurate and unfair. Now, in the end, the bill died in that committee. But that's not quite the end of this story. Recent reporting by the Oregon Capital Chronicle is absolutely worth your time. Okay, so the article was written by Alex Baumhard and published Monday morning. Representative Levy's opposition to the bill did not include any mention of her family business, which would have been affected if the bill passed. In fact, according to the Capital Chronicle, 1 month after her testimony on the bill, the Oregon DEQ sent one of her farms this pre-enforcement notice saying they over-applied fertilizer on cornfields 2 years ago, polluting the groundwater below. Now, it's important to note that Representative Levy does report her family's businesses to the state's Ethics Commission at the beginning of each session. She receives income from 7 businesses, but she is not barred from sponsoring, testifying, or even voting on bills that would affect her businesses. The state law actually requires her to vote on bills, even if she says there's a conflict of interest.
Her response to me was more or less like, I'm following the law, which is I'm required to vote. I declare a conflict of interest if I'm going to vote. And to her perception of the whole situation, she's not independently materially benefiting or being damaged by these bills. That being said, I think you can make a compelling argument that, you know, if your family's business was repeatedly fined for over applying fertilizer and you spoke out against a bill that would require that fertilizer application being reported to the state, you know, getting that bill defeated helps the family business. You're not getting fined for this stuff, and you're not being monitored and regulated for it in the same way.
Now, a nonpartisan group called Common Cause Oregon says the state's ethics laws are behind when it comes to lawmakers being able to or required to vote on bills with a financial conflict of interest. But the question remains, is Representative Levy looking out for her constituents or her own interests? Well, she's adamant that her constituents are top of mind. But that public hearing on Senate Bill 747 put the issue front and center.
You know, the people that got up to speak out against it were Rep. Levy, a few other Oregon representatives who have land or work in agricultural industry or tangential or near it. The people that got up to speak in favor of that bill are like people who cannot drink their water. So they had their representatives. You've got people from Boardman, from Morrow County, from Umatilla County showing up to say, please pass this bill. It would go a long way to help us deal with this way too long-seated problem with contaminated water out here. And the very people that are representing them are at that public hearing speaking out against the bill.
And turns out the fertilizer bill was not the only one where Representative Levy has lobbied either for or against when her businesses and past deals she's made could be negatively affected. Now, that includes a bill regarding a power usage by data centers. And not long ago, one of Representative Levy's family businesses sold Amazon more than 100 acres of land for nearly $3.7 million, where the company is building a new data center. If you want to read more about that, as well as current efforts to modernize Oregon's ethics laws, you'll want to read Alex's full article. You can find it right now on OregonCapitalChronicle.com.